Hi everyone, Azim here. We are continuing our discussion on tissues, specifically epithelial tissue. We are in the Chapter 4 notes, starting on slide 23. We've talked about the basics of epithelial tissue, like the major characteristics. We've talked about the different types of epithelial tissue, categorized based on layers and shapes. Here we're going over some specialized characteristics of epithelial tissue. So we've been talking about epithelial tissue, that's one of the 4 tissue types. Nervous tissue is another of the tissue types. There's epithelial, connective, nervous, and muscle. Now, why am I mentioning nervous tissue? The purpose of nervous tissue, or at least one of the purposes of nervous tissue, is to sense things, to figure out what's going on inside and outside of your body. Like, what's the temperature of your skin? Is something touching you? Are you itchy? Are you in pain? You need nerve endings, little branches of nervous tissue, to reach the surfaces of your body, whether it's your outer skin or lining your tracts, in order to sense these things. So nervous tissue can be found within epithelial tissue. They right next to each other, they coexist. They allow for sensation. You can see that pictured over here. If this is a picture of skin down here, you can see these nerve branches extending into the epithelium. Most epithelium, whether it's skin or tracts, are highly innervated. There are lots of nerve endings. The term nerve ending are the branches of sensory neurons that sense things. And we'll talk about this in way more detail when we get to the nervous system, but this is what I'd like you to know for now. There is a mix of nervous tissue in epithelial tissue. It allows, by being located where epithelial tissue is located, we can communicate what's going on outside of our body, whether it's skin or tracts, to our brains and spinal cord. There's many different sensory neuron types, many different nerve ending types. We'll go over all these later, so don't worry about that quite yet. What's interesting, though, is that while nervous tissue, one thing that it's really important for is for sensing, there is some epithelial tissue that also is adapted for sensation. Special epithelial tissue that's adapted for sensation is given a name neuroepithelium. Neuroepithelium. These are special sensory receptor cells. Special sensory receptor cells. Instead of just having, let's say I'm drawing a neuron right now. You'll understand my drawing when we get to the nervous system, but I've drawn a neuron, and here I've drawn nerve endings of our neuron. Sometimes those nerve endings on their own can sense stuff from your skin or wherever. But sometimes we need special neuroepithelial cells Sometimes we need special neuroepithelial cells to sense something and then relay that information to a neuron. So 2 important characteristics here so far about neuroepithelium, or maybe 3. It is epithelium. It can sense stuff, whether it's some kind of touch or some kind of chemical, or something else. We'll get to those things later. And it can relay that information to a neuron. So it's an epithelial cell talking to a nervous system cell, a neuron. So 3 things. Examples of neuroepithelium include gustatory cells. Gustatory cells are the cells in your taste buds. You have many of these cells in your taste buds, and they detect taste chemicals that relay information to a neuron. Gustatory cells are neuroepithelium. In order for you to see, you have photoreceptors. Photo means light. They're receptors for light. In the back of your eye, it's called the retina, you've got these cells here. Maybe you've heard of rods and cones. These cells are neuroepithelium. They detect light and they relay information to neurons. Photoreceptors are neuroepithelium. Another kind is called a hair cell. I know you might think hair cell, is that the cell used for your hair on your head or wherever else on your body? It's not that kind of hair. Hair cell looks like this, and it has specific apical structures called stereocilia. We've learned about cilia, and cilia are these hair-like structures that help with sweeping. Stereocilia are not for sweeping. What they are for, in this case, for hair cells, they're for bending in a specific direction. Here is a scanning electron micrograph of the stereocilia of hair cells. And you can see that some are short and some are long. There's a sidedness to it. The word stereo means there's sides. Like a stereo speaker, you got right and left speaker. Stereocilia, you've got cilia that are taller and shorter. And because of that, they can bend in a certain direction. And when they do bend in a certain direction, that's when these cells, these neuroepithelial cells, get activated. Where do we find a stereocilia? Why would they be bending? They're used for pressure coming from hearing or for your sense of balance. It's called your vestibular sense. If you're not quite sure what that is quite yet, we'll get to that later. Very broadly, it has to do with balance. Head movement. So those are 3 examples of neuroepithelium. Gustatory cells on your tongue, taste buds, photoreceptors in your back of your eye, the retina, hair cells in your inner ear for balance and hearing. Besides neuroepithelium, there's other special epithelial cells that we've actually alluded to or mentioned explicitly, actually, but glands. Glands are cells that can secrete molecules, high amounts of molecules. Glands are epithelial tissue. So not all epithelial cells are secreting a lot. I mean, they can all secrete, but not in super high amounts. Glands secrete a lot. And there are 2 different types of glands. There are exocrine glands and there are endocrine glands. Exocrine glands are glands that secrete to a lumen, to an outer lumen. When I say outer lumen, I mean either to the surface of your skin or a tract, like your digestive tract or respiratory tract or reproductive tract, into one of those spaces. Exocrine glands secrete through ducts to the surface of a cavity or lumen. Usually they're cuboidal, sometimes they're columnar, but usually cuboidal. We've actually seen this with salivary glands. We'll see this in a minute. I'll show you the histology. I do want to mention endocrine glands, though. Endocrine glands are within. Endo means within, exo means to the outside. So if you're not secreting to the outside, where are you secreting to? You're secreting into the blood. You're secreting hormones into the plasma of the blood, into that fluid space. So specifically, the word endocrine means glands that secrete into the bloodstream. Exocrine secretes to a lumen, a cavity, to the surface of your skin. They're all usually cuboidal, sometimes columnar. We have a whole separate chapter on the endocrine system. We'll focus on that later. Right now, let's focus on exocrine glands. There's several types of exocrine glands. So here's our first type of exocrine gland. It is called a Merocrine gland. A Merocrine gland, a type of exocrine gland. So we're secreting to some lumen or cavity or surface of the skin. We're secreting by exocytosis. You've seen this before. It's where you have a vesicle full of proteins and other stuff. And that vesicle gets released to the outside because the membrane of the vesicle, those phospholipids, can fuse with the phospholipids of the plasma membrane and just release its contents to the outside. There are several examples of Merocrine glands that we've seen before, and maybe some that are new to you. When you think of sweat, the watery sweat that we secrete on our skin, there's a very particular term for this because we're going to go over a different type of sweat. But the watery sweat that you know of when you get hot, when you work out, it's called Exocrine pseudoriferous. I know it's a long name. Exocrine pseudoriferous. Exocrine pseudoriferous. You can see here, this is actually an Exocrine pseudoriferous gland. You can see the keratinized stratified squamous cells of skin. And then what this dark coiled tube, that's the gland. That's the Exocrine pseudoriferous gland. So you'd secrete sweat to the surface of the skin for the purposes of cooling you down, among other things, but that's a main thing. Sweat is watery. It is full of other things, including ions. Sometimes you'll find proteins, but mostly water and ions. When you cry, whether because you're sad or just when you release tears because you want to lubricate your eye and also clear out any junk that's gotten into your eye, that's produced by your lacrimal glands. So lacrimal glands are for tear production. The glands that are in the lining of your stomach to release acid, to release enzymes for digestion, to help you break down food, those are called gastric glands. Gastric is related to the stomach. Similarly, you have glands in the intestines, boring name, intestinal glands. They are for releasing enzymes and other important things to help with digestion and absorption of nutrients. And we've talked about salivary glands, how they are cuboidal cells. They release stuff by exocytosis into a duct. That's how we release saliva into our oral cavity, our mouth. What all these have in common, despite these being fairly different types of glands, is they all secrete their substance by exocytosis. On the whole, these glands are releasing fluids that have water and protein. Specifically, the ones mentioned here are serous cells. So these are cuboidal cells. They're called serous cells. They release by a merocrine type of secretion. They're released by exocytosis. Serous cells appear darker. They stain darker. They release a serous fluid. You've seen that word before. Serous means watery, slippery. Serous cells release a serous fluid. All of these are serous secretions: tears, sweat, watery sweat, gastric secretions, intestinal secretions, saliva. Well, some of your saliva, the watery saliva. We'll get to the other type of saliva here in a second. These are all serous secretions. Now I know that we have a thicker mucousy secretion from our saliva. Sometimes you have a watery saliva, sometimes you have a thick, sticky saliva. That thick, sticky saliva, also by merocrine secretion, but from a different cell type. These are mucous cells. There's a difference between serous cells. Take a look at the picture down here. This is histology of the salivary gland. You can see serous cells pointed out as these dark cells. All these groupings of darker cells, what you're seeing here is a bunch of simple cuboidal cells surrounding a lumen. All those dark cells are serous cells. Darker serous cells release a watery protein-filled secretion. Mucous cells, though, are the lighter colored cells that you see here. Mucous cells are the lighter colored cells. Mucous cells secrete mucus. M-U-C-O-U-S is the adjective. M-U-C-U-S is the noun. So they sound the same, but that's why there's a difference in spelling. Mucous cells secrete mucus. It's a thicker, more protein-filled secretion. Still by exocytosis, but it's more protein-filled, so it's thicker and stickier. You have this in your stomach. You have gastric glands in your stomach, but you also have mucus cells in your stomach to release mucus. You need lots of mucus to protect the lining of your stomach from all that acid. Your salivary glands also have a mix of serous and mucus cells. There is a big difference. Remember, serous cells stain darker, mucus cells stain lighter. Here you can see this is in the stomach. All these light colored mucus cells next to each other, they stain lighter. The mucus is reflecting the light and it's hiding the nucleus. You can't really see the nucleus. It's there, just have to believe me. The nucleus is there, it's hiding because the mucus is reflecting light and obscuring it. The darker ones are serous, the lighter ones are mucus. They're both Merocrine glands. They're both released by exocytosis. There is one more Merocrine gland I'd like to go over, and this is called a goblet cell. A goblet cell is actually just like a mucus cell. Let's go back for a second. Here, you can see these mucus cells. Take a look at the bottom right. These mucus cells are all clumped up together. They're always in groupings. These mucus cells in the stomach are all clumped up together. They're always in a group. The only difference between mucus cells and goblet cells is that goblet cells are individual rather than clustered. They're off on their own. So in this illustration of, let's say, the trachea, it's somewhere in the respiratory epithelium, you see a goblet cell here and one here and one here. It's interspersed. It's interspersed between the rest of the epithelium. The goblet cells still appear light colored. They're just interspersed between the rest of the epithelium. You can find this in your respiratory tract, your trachea. You can find this in the small and large intestines. You produce mucus for protecting these areas. So goblet cells they release the same thing as mucus cells. They both release mucus, just how they're arranged. So all of that, goblet cells, mucus cells, serous cells, all of that was under merocrine secretion. They all released by exocytosis. Our next exocrine gland type is called apocrine. Apocrine, apo means towards the top, like apical. So apocrine is releasing secretions. I mean, you're always releasing towards the top, but the difference is rather than releasing by exocytosis, that apical side is shedding. Take a look at this process that I've just squared right there, rectanguled. The cell, you can see the main part of the cell. There's a top part right here, and that top part breaks down. It breaks off and is released into the lumen of wherever you're releasing it to. Then you keep growing the cell in size and you repeat it again. You're using a lot of Golgi apparatus here because you need lots of membrane production to keep doing this. Exocrine, you're releasing water and protein. Apocrine, you're releasing water and protein still because you're releasing stuff from the inside of the cell. But now you're getting a lot of lipids. Part of that is because of the phospholipids found in membranes. Remember, phospholipids are found in membranes. You're getting all of this membrane shedding off. So we get more fat in this in the secretion type. Mammary glands, milk production is by apocrine secretion. So when you drink milk from whatever animal you're drinking, what that is a product of shed cells coming from that organism's glands. Fun thought. Nutritious though, very nutritious, which is great for offspring. There are other uses. It could be used for nutrition, like with mammary glands. Our ears, or really our ear canals, the epithelium there, we have a specialized gland called ceruminous glands. Ceruminous. Cerumen, this is the noun. Ceruminous is the adjective. Cerumen is earwax. So we produce earwax, and wax, if you weren't familiar, is a type of lipid. Like beeswax or really any kind of wax. Wax is a lipid type, but earwax, the wax we produce in our ears, is sticky so they can catch any stuff that's getting into our ears. We don't want to go too far. So earwax is also produced as an apocrine secretion. Pieces of the cells are shedding off. Let me point out that mammary gland again. Here's histology of a mammary gland, simple cuboidal cells facing a lumen. You're secreting, you're shedding into this lumen to produce milk. You have mammary glands, those are apocrine. You have ceruminous glands, those are apocrine. Here's another apocrine gland. It is called an apocrine pseudoriferous gland. We went over ecrine pseudoriferous, that's a merocrine type, and it's watery. Apocrine pseudoriferous is a thicker sweat. It's a thicker sweat. Because it's a thicker sweat, a wider lumen is needed. Take a look at this histology at the top right. You can see ecrine pseudoriferous glands. The lumen is very narrow. The lumen for these tubes, these ducts, are very narrow. But look at the lumen size for these apocrine glands. Still simple cuboidal cells, maybe even stratified in some portions, but much wider lumen, so that you can secrete that thicker substance. This thick sweat is found not all over your body. It's found in very specific regions of your body. Your axillary region, those are your armpits. Your pubic inguinal region, where your genitalia are. Areolar region. What I mean by areolar is around the nipple, the more pigmented part of the surrounding the nipple. What all these places have in common? Well, one thing that all these places have in common is that there's a lot of friction, and potentially a lot of friction around the nipple, especially if you're breastfeeding. And so this thicker sweat can provide some lubrication. Another thought as to why do you find this thicker sweat in your armpits and in your pubic region is that it gives off pheromones. That's the whole thing that we're not going to discuss really, getting into pheromones and what they do and the debatable impact of them on humans, since we don't have very developed pheromonal regions of our brain compared to other animals. But there's a reason why we have a lot of scent coming from those areas, why it tends to be smellier than our other sweat. So apocrine pseudoriferous is different from ecrine pseudoriferous. Ecrine pseudoriferous, smaller lumen, watery sweat by exocytosis. Apocrine pseudoriferous, thicker sweat by apocrine secretion, which is shedding, and it's only in specific parts of your body. One more type of exocrine gland. We've gone over merocrine, apocrine, and now this is holocrine. A holocrine gland is a gland that doesn't release by exocytosis. It doesn't release by shedding off the top part and then continuing to grow, shed, like you do with a lot of crops. This is where the whole cell just dies. I'm being dramatic here, but when I say it bursts, it doesn't like explode. It bursts as in like the cell membrane breaks and everything inside of it, including the whole cell itself, just gets released. So this is especially oily, high amounts of lipid. This is especially oily. The main example that we're going over are sebaceous glands. Sebaceous glands are glands in the skin. You release this oily product. The oily product is called sebum, and it covers your hair, it covers your skin to waterproof it and lubricate it. If you're familiar with dry skin, it can be very damaging. It can feel very, very damaged and hurt. We need a layer of lubrication to protect us, prevent dehydration and lubricate. Too much oil can be an issue that can lead to things like acne. Too little oil is an issue that can lead to damaged dry skin and poor quality hair. Sebaceous glands, they look very interesting. Take a look at this histology at the top right. Where I just circled and I'm coloring in, this is where a hair would be. This is a cross section of a hair. These glands, these sebaceous glands, are always neighboring a hair, because in order for that sebum, that oil, to reach the surface of the skin, it wicks itself up the hair to the surface, which is why your hair, if you don't wash it after a while, can get oily. It's the buildup of sebum. It's traveling along the hair. So these sebaceous glands are these clusters of light-colored cells. You can see the nucleus. It looks like a small dot, but they are light-colored. So distinguish that from goblet and mucous cells. Goblet and mucous cells, you couldn't see the nucleus, and they're light-colored. Here, you can see the nucleus, and they're light-colored, and they're clustered together, kind of like a cluster of grapes, and they're always next to a hair in the skin because they have to travel up. But what's going on in these cells is that these cells are dying. They're releasing their entire contents. And inside of them, they have protein, they have water, and they have lots of lipids, lots of fats, makes it very oily. Let's take a quick look at this with the histology videos that I have. So I'm going to switch over to my videos. If you're following along, you go to the microscopes and histology playlist. Number 14 is epithelium. Number 16 is skin histology with glands. And if you want to see mammary glands, that's all the way at the end. Whoop. All the way at the end. Under female reproductive histology, number 72. So I'll just show you a few. Looking at epithelium histology, here we have, we're looking at 400X, the salivary gland. We can see a lot of different cells here. One group of cells, like this one here, you can see that there's a bunch of cuboidal cells surrounding a lumen, which I'll color in black, the lumen. Kind of looks like a flower. But those cells that I've colored in orange, they are light colored. Those are mucous cells. They are grouped together, they're mucous cells. Mucous cells released by merocrine secretion, and it's therefore a type of exocrine gland. They release a thick mucus. Whereas darker ones, like this one here or this one here, what we see still simple cuboidal cells surrounding a lumen, but they're darker. These are serous cells, still merocrine, and therefore a type of exocrine gland. They just release a more watery, protein-filled secretion. There's a difference between watery saliva and thick mucousy saliva. One's for having the proteins, the enzymes for digestion. One's for lubricating your mouth so you don't cut yourself when you're eating something dry. I'm switched over to the skin histology that includes glands. This is 40x of the skin. You can see the epithelium up here, and you can see where the hair is, these long things. If you look over here, we'll circle it, here, here. Do you see these darker cells? There are these really dark cells that are pretty deep. So that's epithelium. It's not by the skin surface. So why are they so deep? It's because they're glands. These glands are deeper. This is now 100x. Let's point out one of the gland types. The major gland type that we can see here in many clusters, all of these clusters that I'm circling, they're light colored. These are sebaceous glands, which is a type of holocrine secretion, which of course is an exocrine gland. Sebaceous glands release the oily sebum. They're always next to a hair. Always next to a hair. This is 400x. You can see an individual cell. An individual sebaceous gland cell. Cuboidal, clear in the cytoplasm. The nucleus looks like a little dot. This is back at 100x. These glands here, so sebaceous you can see up here. But these glands you see down here, they're darker and the lumen is pretty small. These are Apocrine pseudoriferous. Those are Apocrine pseudoriferous glands. That's a type of merocrine secretion. That's a type of merocrine secretion. Sebaceous, again, is a type of holocrine. They're both exocrine, but how they release the stuff differs. This is from the scalp. This is why that's why there's so much hair in this histology. If I switch to a different part of the body, this slide, unfortunately, isn't stained as well as the one we just saw, but you can still see that this is the surface. You can see the epithelium that's darker here, and then there's deeper skin layers. But then we see more epithelium down here. Do you see all these darker cells? Those darker cells towards the bottom are glands. This is 40x right now. I'm going to go closer to these. We're at 100x now. We are in axillary skin. So this is in the armpit. Axillary skin, and we're looking deeper from the surface. All of these glands, these are Apocrine pseudoriferous. Note how the lumen, I can sketch out. what this looks like. The lumen is relatively small. That's eccrine pseudoriferous, which is a type of merocrine secretion. It's the watery sweat. But over here, this one and this one and this one, the lumen is much larger. Larger lumen means this is an apocrine pseudoriferous gland, which is a type of apocrine secretion, thicker sweat when we're shedding from the surface, from the apical side. So those are just some examples of the different gland types. Oh, you know what? Sorry. Let me show you goblet cells. I showed you serous cells, mucous cells. Let me show you goblet cells. I need to go back to the epithelial histology video. And let's go to here. So we're in the intestines, small intestines. It's 100x. This is 400x. You can kind of see it here. I'm going to move back here. 400x, small intestines. You can see simple columnar cells here, but interspersed between the simple columnar epithelium, we can see these really light colored cells. Light colored, light colored, light colored, light colored. These light colored cells, those are goblet cells. And they too secrete mucus, just like mucus cells. They're just arranged differently. We find goblet cells in places like the trachea, respiratory tract, and intestines, small and large intestines. The stomach has mucus cells, the intestines has goblet cells. All right, those are the different gland types. We went over some basic neuroepithelium, and we'll take a look at that more in the future, but hope that helped. Let me know if you have questions, leave it in the discussion, in the comments. And yeah, that's it for epithelium. In the next set of video for the chapter 4, so when we start after this slide, it will be connective tissue. All right, see you next time.